All right, it's the Wilk Report. I'm Michael Wilk coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. And with me today is Larry Bernard. How are you doing, Larry?
Doing great.
All right. We are talking today about three topics, two of them kind of related. That is Black Panther and Avengers Infinity War. Then we're going to complete with a discussion of Cobra Kai, which is the new YouTube Red series, detailing the continuing adventures of the Karate Kid and his rival Johnny Lawrence from Cobra Kai, but it's told from the point of view of Johnny Lawrence mostly. So, all right, so we're going to go to discussion. We're going to share screen for Black Panther. And it shows here.
There we go.
Yeah, we've got Black Panther sinks Titanic and topped $1.3 billion for the box office. Now, this is pretty significant because the gross profits ended up doing pretty well. So if you go by this, then you're going to go ahead and see that, it's really doing well. All right, so then we've got Avengers Infinity War, which let me go ahead and...
It is also crushing records.
Yeah, it's set to go to 1 billion speed record. That was as of May 4th, and of course it's now May the 20th, so it's probably past the $1 billion mark. But you know what really got me here is that these are really kind of kicking butt over The Last Jedi, which, you know, depending on what numbers, depending on what numbers you believe, its net profit came, if you believe Deadline.com, I'm not sure I do, but they're claiming they made $417 million profit. World Class Bullshitters, if you believe their numbers, it only made $166 million gross profit. It's probably somewhere in between those two figures, but it's still way short of what the 659 million needs in order to. But with the Black Panther and Avengers,
I'm sure Disney will tell the IRS that The Last Jedi lost money, though, so it'll all work out in the wash.
Well, that's the thing, because Disney doesn't want to admit that it might have lost money on that, and because if you look at it from a purely business standpoint, you know, because you're not just talking about the production budget, there's the marketing budget, there's the cut that the theaters take. Disney took a larger share than normal, which was like 35%. It still failed to get the target that it needed, which was something like $659 million per year, per movie, in order to get a healthy return on the investment that it made when it plopped down $4 billion for the Star Wars franchise. So, you know, compared to the Marvel wing, you know, this is pretty terrible. So, you know, Marvel's kicking butt, but Lucasfilm is kind of falling by the wayside.
That's a discussion that's really going to take a lot longer than we have budgeted for today. But it's very interesting that the strategy that Lucas is doing doesn't make sense. They're putting a lot of diverse content out, but not in the movies, in the supplementary media. There's diverse content going into the cartoon shows, into the books, and into the hypothetical future Disney streaming service TV show that's going to come out. They're not actually focusing it in their core media, but they're alluding to it in the core media, which is very disingenuous. Whereas Marvel says, yeah, we got a black superhero in a country full of black people. Cast is mostly black. Director's black. Writer's black. And we're going to make a ton of money.
Yeah, and, you know, it's amazing to me because the novelization for The Last Jedi is basically making up for all of the shortcomings in the actual cinema. And, you know, normally for a novelization, what ends up happening is you get, some stuff that, it's interesting. Like you say, for example, the novelization for the movie Gremlins. All right. Now, I had this back in the 80s when the movie first came out. And, it offered some backstory to Gizmo, the origins of the Mogwai and stuff. It was interesting, but you didn't really need it in order to enjoy the movie. Now, for The Last Jedi, the difference is the novelization is trying to make up for everything that should have gone into The Last Jedi. And it's like,
yeah,
it's just failing because, when you have to rely on the novelization or tie-in media to explain stuff that should have been in the movie to begin with, that's a sign you've made a bad movie. But you're not seeing that, with the Marvel wing.
maybe.
Not, at least not so much. I mean, they've
No.
already got the comics, so you don't need to actually do it. But the movies are kind of, I don't want to say loosely based on the comics, but they're not exactly faithful. But what they do remain faithful to, it's in the spirit, if not necessarily the letter. So you can kind of forgive that. But with but to get back to the point, if you have to rely on the tie-in media to tell the story that you should have told on the screen, you've done something wrong.
Yeah. And later we could do something interesting because there was a leak from the episode 9 storyboards that came out on 4chan and Reddit that's discussed the fact that what The Last Jedi was all about doing was a soft rolling reboot of the Star Wars franchise that will be completed by episode 9. But Black Panther, on the other hand, it didn't try to reboot the Marvel Universe. It tried to tell as good a story as it could in the material it was given. Wakanda's kind of odd element of the Marvel Universe. And they told as compelling a story as they could and also throw in the necessary and requisite comic book action. Whereas Infinity War, it was just comic book action with story elements pasted onto the edges of the action where they could.
Yeah, I had heard that, and it's interesting because I remember reading this article, actually kind of criticizing the depiction of Wakanda, saying that it's actually a fundamentally conservative country and with a conservative social structure, and I can kind of see that. Although the intent of the article, I guess, was to try and say that this is a much more conservative film than people realize. But I actually think the author of that piece kind of missed a point because the conflict of the story is driven by the fact that, yes, Wakanda is a very conservative and in some ways backward society, despite its technological advancements, because, yeah, it still clings to this monarchy that's, very patriarchal. It's, very greedy in hoarding its wealth and technology to the point where not even members of the royal family are safe from a death sentence if they commit the cardinal sin of actually sharing technology or money with the outside world. And, their general attitude towards the rest of Africa and, Africans in other countries outside the continent is basically like, you're on your own. So that is a very conservative country. And so the conflict arises, from all the contradictions and the response to that conservative mindset. And, so it's a surprisingly deep story for a comic book movie. And although they could only go so deep, which is why I think they had so many storytelling shortcomings. So I could kind of forgive it a little bit more. Whereas if it had been geared wholly towards adults, I would have been a lot harsher with it. But overall, I think the storytelling in Black Panther just, it's a kind of storytelling that you do when you actually have read and respect the material. Whereas with The Last Jedi, for example, these are guys who probably haven't even seen Star Wars, much less, respected it. And
well,
there's like this.
There's actually a clip. There's a clip from Ryan Johnson from back when he was doing the world tour for Brick, his first real movie. And he said, I'm really only interested in making the kind of movie that half the people walk out of the theater loving and half the people walk out of the theater hating. Like, well, mission accomplished, Ryan. Mission accomplished.
Yeah, but here's the thing: when you've got a movie like Star Wars, that's not the kind of movie you want half the audience to walk out the door hating and vowing never to return to see the next installment. because Disney plopped down $4 billion for this, and they want to keep it going. So if they've lost half the audience before the trilogy is even complete, guess what? You're in trouble, and you screwed up. And that there's no willingness to admit this, I mean, it just boggles the mind. But, on the other hand, under Kevin Feige with Marvel, you don't have any of that. And there was another article posted on the Midnight's Edge Facebook page where somebody had posted, it was really condescending too. It's like, it said Avengers Infinity War flatters its fans and The Last Jedi challenges them. Well, no, actually it just insults them. It doesn't challenge them. But, but with popular properties like this, you really do need to kind of flatter the people whose money, in the forms of buying the comics, going into the movie theaters and buying tickets and all that. They're the ones whose money made it possible for you to make that movie in the first place. So yes, you do need to respect them. And if that means flattering them a bit, that's what you need to do, because that's the nature of the property that has been bought and you've been charged with making into a movie. So, why you would do that is, it's just beyond comprehension. I mean, you could do that with, say, Watchmen, where, it's already a gritty and, kind of dark and cynical and pessimistic story told by Alan Moore back in the, late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
So, you can do that, but, you're taking that same type of storytelling and applying it to something that really is not a good fit for it. And, what really amazes me is how Kevin Feige seems to get this, but, Zack Snyder, Jar Jar Abrams, Ruin Johnson, Kathleen Kennedy, none of them understand this. And yes, I am using the nasty names for them, but they deserve it. Damn it. They deserve it.
But what Kevin Feige really does well is he mentors young directors who come out of the independent movie space and helps them do a big budget movie, which is very clearly what Kathleen Kennedy has demonstrated she's not good at. Or either that or she made a really big mistake. Well, two mistakes if we count Solo, which is going to be a bad movie, I think. But I think Ron Howard will make it a watchable bad movie.
Yeah, and that's what really cheeses me off, is that, Kathleen Kennedy strikes me as being, this kind of yes woman who is unwilling to tell the hard truths and impose any kind of order. It's like, okay, I can understand, sucking up to the boss, but in this instance, she's the boss, and she does need to lay her foot down. You can't just... I'm sorry, go on.
So it's kind of complicated. It's kind of complicated because if you look at the demographics behind Star Wars, and we need to stop the Star Wars digressions because we do need to go through the good topics on Infinity War, but Star Wars is the only movie that sells most of its money in the US, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom. It sells next to nothing in China, very little in the rest of the world. So they're wanting to try to build a new Star Wars brand within the existing Star Wars brand that can sell better globally. The argument is that the people in the Anglo-American continuum, they're going to keep buying Star Wars no matter what. We can just make all this profit by building a new, better Star Wars.
Yeah, except how well has that been working out? Because it's not even really working out in the West. I mean, it flopped in China. People said they were insulted by it. But on the other hand, getting back to Black Panther and Infinity War, not only are people not insulted, but, they're actually, there are, a mix of reviews, mostly positive, but, where people have been critical, they've done so, but without saying that they felt like their intelligence was being degraded by the film. So
the movies are not malicious to the source material.
Yeah,
they're not malicious to the source material.
Yeah, and and it does kind of boil down to you never want to insult your audience, because that audience is not going to appreciate it, and you can't constantly hide behind the label of sexism or chauvinism or racism or whatever. And so, when I watched Black Panther, even though I did note a number of storytelling flaws, which I'm going to get into, I never got the sense that I was being talked down to. Now, insofar as those flaws go, they're not as many as they could have been. I thought primarily my biggest issues were uh, the way they depicted Killmonger, because it seemed like, here was a villain they could have done really great things with, really kind of built him up into this threat who, from the beginning would have been just awesome. But instead they decided, well, we're going to waste all this time going after Andy Serkis's character, Ulysses Claw, and make it seem like he's a bad guy. And then all of a sudden he gets killed off. Spoilers for people who still haven't seen it, although if you haven't, shame on you. But he gets killed off, and then all of a sudden Killmonger is reintroduced, and then he becomes a bad guy. It's like, so you're basically bringing him in more or less halfway through the story, and then you've got to try and play catch up in developing it and fleshing him out as a character. And I thought, that was kind of a mistake. And I also thought, giving him these two conflicting motivations, one, revenge for his father being killed by his own brother, and then, trying to liberate the African diaspora. But it seems like one motivation had to take a back seat to the other, and revenge won out. And I'm thinking, well, guys, just make a choice here. If you're going to try and do both, you've got to balance those two out. And instead, they made the revenge aspect take precedence. So why even leave in the whole crusading thing if you're not going to develop it?
But you could also look at it that T'Challa represents one side of the African-American soul. And you look at how they do Africa and Wakanda, it's very totemic. It's a representation. It's Pan-African. So he represents this idealized, impure, undamaged Africanness. And Eric Killmonger represents all the grievance, all the anger, all the hurt, all the hatred of both loving your native culture and land, but also being betrayed by them, which is part of the whole narrative journey of the diaspora saga. So that there's an element of that to the story, but it's kind of hard to focus on that when we also have to do the subplot with Claw, which I think mainly was there to kill him so that they can reintroduce him later as his more comic book version of the character. And also do okay, here's the Marvel beat sheet. We need to have an action sequence here, and final giant action sequence here. But this time, no giant blue laser.
Yeah, and I think, that's something that Marvel needs to kind of like scale back on, is trying to fill out the beat sheet. Now, when Blake Snyder wrote about having a beat sheet and Save the Cat, he was talking about, okay, this is what you need to do, but never at the expense of storytelling. And I think, what's happening with the, these beat sheets that have been brought into the forefront of storytelling, it's like, there's so much focus on getting from one beat to the next, you forget to actually tell the story. And I think that's, the big flaw in Black Panther, and probably in Infinity War, because I haven't seen it yet. But and so far as Black Panther,
Doctor Strange,
and so you've got all this.
It was the same flaw in Doctor Strange.
Yeah, and I also noticed it to a lesser extent in, say, the Incredible Hulk and Captain America. So I think they're going to have to try and say, look, guys, the beat sheet is there for a reason, and you should use it, but don't let it take over the story. And I think that is something that going into the next 5 or 10 years for Marvel, is you're going to have to focus more on story, because if you're going to create an action film, that's great, but that's really kind of the flashy stuff. If you don't have the meat and potatoes to really kind of feed people, then you can have all the special effects in the world, you can have all the lazy CGI like they had in Black Panther, which is another gripe I had, because it seemed like that
CGI fight sequence at the end was like really terrible. It was 1990 video games bad.
Yeah, and I got the feeling that much like with Justice League, where they rushed it out before the effects were complete because the guys in charge at the studio wanted to get their year-end bonuses, and they couldn't do that unless the movie was released before Christmas. And so I think they're doing that to a slightly lesser extent with Marvel, but they really should have spent some of that time finishing the effects, or better yet, not rely so much on green screen and just have the two guys on an actual physical set. It might limit you a little bit in what you can do, but that's actually not a bad thing, because I've seen some very low budget productions, like say Dog Soldiers or The Descent, where they didn't load it up with so much CGI. In fact, Dog Soldiers was entirely practical. There were no CGI effects in that one, and they actually did very well with the limitations that they had. So you could have done an actual fight sequence on a built set, and at least had minimal CGI, but you still have those actors. And so the final fight sequence, and those CGI rhinos just were not convincing. So I'm like, guys, focus less on that, tell the story. And but beyond that,
now,
no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
when we're talking about the beat sheet problems and the dumb superhero movie things that you have to do in the superhero movies being a problem with Black Panther and Doctor Strange, for Infinity War, those things were the engines that made the movie work. I don't understand how that happened, but the way the Russo brothers had to do it, because you have a cast on the scale, something like It's a Mad, Mad World, it was really all about the set piece, set piece, set piece, set piece, set piece, set piece. Now let's put together just enough story and narrative to string them all together. It shouldn't have worked, but it did.
Yeah, and this is something I actually learned in film school, where the professor was cautioning us. Look, you have to know the rules before you can break them, and if you get lucky, that's going to show up on the screen. People are not as dumb as studios seem to think, and I think people can tell when someone is just telegraphing it or phoning it in, or just got lucky because he or she didn't know what the hell's going on. It's like if you look at the opening sequence for The Godfather, okay, there are a lot of things that are just not done that the cinematographer actually went ahead and did. For example, you're not supposed to have someone like just sitting there in darkness with just a face or body lit, because it looks like the person's in a void. And you're not supposed to shine a light directly on someone's bald head, because again, it creates a really weird effect. But the way it played out, because the cinematographer knew what he was doing, it actually came off looking like the guy was under a heat lamp, or not a heat lamp, but an interrogation lamp. And it's like, and then they're gradually lighting the scene as it progresses. So these were very deliberate decisions by people who knew what they were doing. Can you say the same thing for, say, Black Panther or Infinity War, where they tried something, got lucky, but also just as easily could have backfired?
I think that they were more intelligent than lucky, but I think the narrative was much simpler in Infinity War, even though it involves hundreds of characters, than it did in Black Panther. It was very simple, very basic. Also, and if you know the comic book, the ending is not really a spoiler. The bad guy wins. So they knew where they were going as well.
Yeah, and
so
I think they did.
They knew what they were doing. Yeah, they knew what they were doing and how they were trying to get there.
Yeah, especially when you've actually got an existing comic book story to use as a blueprint. It's kind of easy to take that and run with it. Whereas if you were coming up with it from scratch, I can see, very much where they might have gone ahead and, failed spectacularly if they had been trying to do this, without any template, but they had an existing one from the comic book. So I think that made it a lot easier for them than it otherwise would have been.
And another element of what made this movie work so well is, in the case of Robert Downey Jr., you have 10 years of characterization of that one character that plays into everything that's going on in the movie. And each of the other characters, you have all their characterization from all the other movies all flowing in. So you don't have to focus so much on characterizing them in this movie. This is just all of their journeys have intersected at this one point.
Yeah, and I think going into the next Avengers film, and I think it's at the point where the Marvel Cinematic Universe is going to start winding down, because the story's really kind of been told, and there's only so long, especially 10 years to keep a franchise going with the same actors and the same story. In terms of the real world, I mean, the guy they had playing T'Challa for Black Panther, he's already 40 years old. and he's going in and playing this. I mean, he looks,
Mhm.
like a decade younger than he really is, and played it. But the truth is, he's 40, and you can only do so many
Yeah.
of these intense action scenes, for so long. And the older you get, the more difficult it's going to be before you have to pass the torch on. So, there, and Robert Downey Jr., he's probably pushing 50 now, if he's not past the 50 mark. You've got the similar problems
Yeah.
with Benedict Cumberbatch, who's approaching his 40s, but then again, I'm sure he doesn't need to do all that much in terms of stunt
Yeah.
work.
Doctor Strange, lighter in action. Tom Holland's amazing in the movie. I think after Tom Holland's Spider-Man progression is up, he's going to be a huge actor, because he doesn't have a whole lot with Spider-Man to do in the movie, considering there's so many other characters. But everything he does in the movie really elevates those sequences. And there's something in the ending, not a spoiler, that he ad-libbed that got put in the final movie that was great.
Yeah, it will be interesting to watch that. Although, some of those actors are great at ad-libbing, and they can get away with it. With Black Panther, I got the sense that there wasn't much room for ad-libbing. Although, if you notice, and this is one of the things that I got a huge kick out of, is if you notice Michael B. Jordan's mercenary digs for
Costume.
it's like you can tell the otaku influence right there.
No. Michael's outright admitted. He said, he talked to them about making it look kind of like Vegeta's outfit.
Yeah,
He
and it's
actually
like,
was talking to costume people about that.
yeah, and that's and that actually goes into the whole debate between inspiration versus imitation, where clearly there's inspiration going on in Black Panther, which is epitomized in things like, say, how Wakanda is depicted, because you've got all these African themes, but they're also blended with kind of like Art Deco and a mix of other architectural styles when we get the view of urban Wakanda. And then, of course, with Michael B. Jordan's Killmonger outfit, he's very clearly channeling Vegeta. So, it's little subtle things like that get thrown in there that people either pick up on or they miss. But, there's stuff going in there. Because, if you go back to the original Star Wars, there's all sorts of inspiration stuff. There's stuff from Kurosawa films, John Ford Westerns, Lord of the Rings, Tolkien type fantasy. So all this stuff kind of blending together along with, some of the Old Republic serials. Because as I understand it, Lucas actually wanted to make a Flash Gordon movie, but was denied. So he went with Star Wars. And of course, the rest is history. But, there's all these influences going into it. Whereas you say, The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi is basically just imitating the first trilogy, and there's nothing really new there. There's nothing else coming in. So you're basically just regurgitating the same old thing. Whereas you've seen Black Panther and Infinity War, you can see all sorts of things that are subtle and not so subtle being played into it.
Now, I do have to say also about Michael B. Jordan, I realized a few days ago, man, they should have cast him as Lando in that Solo movie. He would have been really great and interesting in that. That's not to say Donald Glover isn't going to be good in that part, but man, Michael B. Jordan could have brought something entirely different that, in some respects, is a lot more like Billy D. Williams than Donald Glover has.
Yeah, I know it's interesting because there actually was an actor who had previously played in Young Indiana Jones who actually looks and sounds a lot like Harrison Ford. In fact, he actually did a test video where he just nails the cantina scene from the original Star Wars movie.
Mm-hmm.
And, instead of casting him to play a younger Han Solo, because he looks and sounds like Harrison Ford and he can act, they cast this guy who can't act, who apparently needed an acting coach on set for pretty much the entire shoot. And Ron Howard has to come in and
they also had that guy who they also had that guy who played the young Harrison Ford in that movie with the immortal woman in it, who also nailed being Harrison Ford. Then you have the guy from Baby Driver tried out for it. Whatever his name is, I think it's Ansel Elgort, I think. The guy who was the lead, who played Baby in Baby Driver, he also would have been really good at that. On Ehrenreich, I'm not impressed yet, and I don't think I'm going to be when I see Solo on Friday.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you got Ron Howard, who actually knows how to direct. He's directed some of my favorite films, like Apollo 13. He's directed Willow, although that was kind of like not quite as successful, but it was still one of
Which
my
is a
favorites.
shame. Well, it was a great
Right. So I mean, but Ron Howard actually has the directorial chops to make something good out of something that otherwise would be complete wreck. But I wonder just how much studio interference took place that will kind of make Solo, uh, basically fail because everyone seems to be expecting this movie to bomb big time at the box office, and especially you're putting it up against Avengers Infinity War, you're putting it up against other hot properties that are being released over the summer.
movie. Deadpool.
Yeah, Deadpool 2, which
Yeah,
again is
Deadpool came out. Deadpool actually moved itself up to steal Solo's lunch.
yeah,
Deadpool
apparently
was supposed to release like in June.
yeah, and Deadpool 2, that's uh, giving Infinity War serious competition. Of course, Infinity War has also been out longer, but at the same time, it's like when it has a stronger opening than Infinity War, and then you're releasing a troubled production like Solo to compete against that. I'm reminded of Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, where William Shatner had a bunch of problems going in. He got stiffed on the budget, which was much less than what
Yeah.
Leonard Nimoy was given for his 2 outings as director. He didn't have final cut of the film. Paramount released Star Trek V to compete against Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, against Ghostbusters 2, against Uncle Buck and Batman and all these other stuff. So it just seems like Solo's going to have a lot of those same problems. And so I'm really kind of worried for Ron Howard there. But, in terms of box office success, though, I think it's telling that the 2 Disney movies coming out this year that are expected to do well are the ones where, even if they fall short of expectations, but they're still trying to put out something that's good. Whereas, with the Lucasfilm, it's like they're not even trying. And I think that's telling because it shows what can be done when you put in a little bit of effort into the project. And so we have Marvel Cinematic Universe under Kevin Feige, where he's basically saying, look, guys, you cannot be allowed to half-ass this, okay? If you do, it's going to suffer. So, if you're going to get lazy, there's going to be consequences. And so the directors, even though, some of them did get lazy in certain parts, like Infinity War, I've heard it's a lot less meaty than, say, the previous Avengers movies, but now it's at the point where it's like going into pure action, and you've got, like you said, 10 years of people playing the same characters. So they've already got that level of character development. You don't need to take it all that much further. So that's kind of understandable if the story itself has to suffer a little bit, or at least the characterization has to suffer a little bit, because you've already developed these characters. But
it's
you really
the payoff for 10 years,
right? And now and when you have those that level of development there, then you need to focus even more than ever on plot, because you've already got the characters. People like them. They've been fleshed out to the point where people can sympathize with them. They're more easily related to. So now you have to focus on the plot. And with Infinity War, I've heard mixed reviews about the plot, but I assume you've seen it, so you could probably tell me more about that.
The plot is very simple. There are things that I walked into that movie actually kind of surprised about how they executed the plot. And I hate to bring up and kick Last Jedi again, but we're going to kick The Last Jedi again. Infinity War and how it executed its plot subverted expectations. But it subverted expectations by having characters do things that are true to their character, as opposed to having characters do things that are not true to their character, but they need to happen for the movie to keep going.
Yeah, and this serves as an example for because Ryan Johnson or Ruin Johnson, I'll keep calling him that because that's what he is. He just ruins everything he touches. I mean, I caught bits of Brick and Looper over the past couple of weeks, and they were just awful. But the difference is, like you said, but doing subverting expectations, but staying true to the character. And Johnson just decided, oh, well, since I started writing the screenplay while the last movie was still in production and I have no idea how the first movie is going to end, well, I'm just going to do whatever I want and then, just let the chips fall where they may. But, that's not subverting expectations. That's basically, just doing whatever without any kind of information whatsoever. Yeah. And then, hoping that you can fool enough people into buying the crap that you've just produced. And it's like, nope, sorry, we're not buying it. So, Johnson, I think
also
every time he and Abrams open their mouths, I think they demonstrate how much they don't know about filmmaking. And they've been at this presumably for a number of years now, and they still don't know it. All they know is the technical aspects. No one's ever taught them how to tell a story. Yeah. Whereas, you see Ryan Coogler, who did tell an actual story. And then, of course, the Russo brothers, they told an actual story. Now, you may or may not like that story, but, they know what they're doing. And that, I think, is a crucial difference between Marvel under Kevin Feige and Lucasfilm under Kathleen Kennedy, is that Disney is so hell-bent on trying to milk Star Wars for every last drop that they forgot the reason why it's so successful is because of the story. If you don't have that, then you're just wasting money. Whereas with Kevin Feige,
which is the really interesting thing about Cobra Kai. When it first came out, I didn't want to see it, but I saw it because we were going to do this. And what sold me on Cobra Kai when I actually watched it was the story. And the things that I thought going into it were actually addressed in the story of the show, which is what kind of surprised me. It was a lot better thought out writing than I expected.
Yeah, and speaking of that, let's go ahead and share the screen capture for the article because we really do need to move on. And so, YouTube Red's Karate Kid sequel may be a one-joke premise. Yeah, kind of, but Ralph Macchio and William Zabka really came in and gave it their all. But one of the things that I was really surprised by with this production, perhaps because they had such a low budget going in, that they had no choice but to focus on the story and the characters. So they really had to focus on that, and it just worked. And what really did it for me was just the level of respect that was obvious here for the original material, because they're continuing the story of the Karate Kid, but from the point of view of Johnny Lawrence, the bully from the original one. And they've actually turned him into a real character, someone you can actually relate to. Whereas now Ralph Macchio, now he's kind of like the two-dimensional bad guy, but even he gets his time getting developed further, even though he's had kind of like 3 movies within the franchise to really work on it. But towards the end of the first season, because they're getting a second one greenlit for next year, they even kind of like resolved some of the issues between the two men, towards the end of the series. I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but I had gotten the 30-day free trial for YouTube Red, and although they had like the first 2 episodes for free, and that's how I got into it, because I was like, okay, I'll get the 30-day trial period, then cancel, and then if I want to go see season 2, then I'll just shell out $10 for a month and binge watch it, or find some other way of watching. But my only real problem with Cobra Kai so far is the method of distribution, and I think Midnight's Edge for their video had much the same problem, is that you're putting it on a form of distribution, namely YouTube Red, which it's another streaming service that really doesn't have anything else going for it outside of this show that you've created. So you're really kind of limiting the audience to like this very niche audience, kind of like with Netflix or Hulu or Vudu. And the more streaming services are created, because it used to be Netflix was primarily the streaming service competing with cable and satellite, but now you've got Vudu, you've got Hulu, you've got CBS All Access, Disney's getting
Amazon Prime,
right? So and YouTube Red just seems like CBS, in that they're playing catch up and trying to develop watchable content. And I think the danger here is that, maybe we all get maybe one or two more seasons of Cobra Kai before it either moves to network or DVD and then just gets canceled because, there's such a glut of streaming services. People have to make a decision. Do I want to shell out like 80, 90, like $120 a month on top of cable and satellite? And I don't think people are going to want to make
But
that.
eventually the streaming services are going to build up an infrastructure where the shows can then just directly go to the audience. But that's a whole other long argument that there's very interesting things about. What struck me first about Cobra Kai was that it directly hit the idea of the nostalgia mining that we're doing with our culture right now head on. And it outwardly pointed out that not only was it toxic, especially to Johnny, but also to a lesser extent to Danny as well, but that the nostalgia mining also has a positive element to it, because that whole sequence with Iron Eagle that's in there helped Johnny turn himself around and get his focus back on what he needed to do with his life. So it's like, yes, this whole focus on nostalgia, focus on the past can kill you, but it can also be a well of strength, which was kind of shocking to me that they had that level of thought put into the writing.
Yeah, and it actually, what I took away from that was like, you can learn from the past without living in it. And for 30 years, Johnny's been kind of living in the past and unable to move on, which is the source of his problems, and why 34 years after he got his face kicked in by Danny, he's basically trying to climb up from this pit that he's in and having to go through all these troubles. And so I think the writers did a very they could have failed spectacularly, but I think because they had such respect for the material, they weren't willing to, play it off as just a one-off joke for laughs and then run it into the ground. They actually had to focus on, the reasons why Johnny is the way he is, because he never had that style of teaching that Mr. Miyagi had given Daniel, where, he's able to find a more balanced approach to life. Whereas, John Kreese, Terry Silver in the third movie, because I guess they couldn't bring back that they wanted to tell another story without focusing it so much on him. But, they went ahead and played it very well and making him into a fleshed out character and forcing him to confront this life he's had where, the father figures he's had really have been like bad father figures. One only offered money and disdain. The other offered discipline, sort of, but the sort of discipline that comes from fighting in the jungles of Vietnam in a pointless and screwed up war that was kill or be killed. And we see how bankrupt that mentality is once you transfer it to a civilian lifestyle. And so true to the caution that Mr. Miyagi had given to Daniel, saying there's no bad student, only bad teachers. And so the show itself focuses on Johnny coming to realize that, the reason his life is so screwed up is because he did have bad teachers. And he's realizing that because he had those bad teachers, he never learned how to become a good teacher himself. And now I think for season 2, they're going to focus on the consequences for that. And, this is something that actually has a payoff to the promise that's been set up, which is another thing I like about this show, is that it doesn't break its promises. When it promises a payoff, it delivers. Whereas if you see Sherlock by Stephen Moffat or STD on CBS, right? I mean, they promise payoff, but then never deliver, and then they call you stupid for ever expecting a payoff. But with Cobra Kai, you get the payoff, pretty much by the end of the season.
Yeah.
And as a result, everyone has learned and grown to some extent. And now I think for setting up the second season, again, for people who haven't seen it, I won't spoil it too much, but Johnny's going to have to directly confront his past and try and figure out how he's going to climb out of this hole, because the victory he won at the end of season 1 turned out to be very hollow, because he's grown to the point where he recognizes that his sensei's methods just don't work as an approach to life. And this is,
well, what's interesting is he actually found elements of his sensei's philosophy that he could assert positively, which is very interesting because you always hear people say everyone's the hero of their own story. But you actually were able to make the two-dimensional 1980s villain ideology and philosophy into something that you would actually believe a human being could get pulled into, and something that a compassionate human being can take the good elements of and get rid of the bad.
Yeah, and again, this is what I liked about the show. It's very adult level of writing, where it doesn't pander to the lowest common denominator. It doesn't insult you by talking down to you. It actually forces you to think about the consequences of this stuff. And this is the kind of writing that should have gone into, like, say, The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens. It's a kind of writing that should have gone into a lot of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because for all the adult level writing for Black Panther, which I thought was surprisingly deep for a comic book movie, but at the same time, it struggled to maintain a balance between telling a story that was deep and actually elevated you mentally and spiritually, and had to balance that with, okay, it's a comic book movie and it's an action film, so we need to make it that. And so, and I think they were put in an impossible position of trying to juggle the two, and of course, action movie won out over the meat and potatoes. But with Cobra Kai, because of the nature of the story being told, it's basically just meat and potatoes, and it kind of strips away all the fluff, so that you're forced to actually think about the stuff that's being written here and told through the visual medium. So, and like you said, there's this whole kind of confronting the past and realizing you can take the bits that work out of the Cobra Kai philosophy and realize that you don't have to abide by everything that's in there, like that whole no mercy bit. Johnny is really kind of forced to confront the ramifications for that by the end of the series.
Also, it does a very good portrayal of youth culture. It doesn't pander to the way people want to think about younger people. It also doesn't want to pander to the idea of parents enabling bad behavior in their children out of just, a pat the kids on the head mentality. It's very realistic about that, which is something else that was very refreshing. Yeah,
and John Carpenter actually did that to some extent with the original Halloween and Laurie Strode, where her friends played by PJ Soles and Nancy Loomis were kind of like shallow, one-dimensional, and so obsessed with getting laid, and that's why they get killed, because they're too irresponsible to pay attention to what's going on. But with the depiction of Laurie Strode, it is realistic. It is very close to how an actual teenager would behave, and because of that, she's more easily related to. And similar with Cobra Kai, these are not one or two dimensional caricatures. They're actual fleshed out characters, and you really have to develop that so that people can relate to it. And again, I keep talking about this having a lower budget, so they're kind of forced to focus on the storytelling. But that is true.
Art through adversity.
Yeah,
it's art through adversity.
Yeah, and it's and it just kind of demonstrates what you can do when you don't have $200 or $250 million just to spend on production alone. It's like when you're forced to operate within a set of limitations, then you have to get really creative with the material that you're given so that you can overcome those limitations in storytelling. And so, I think there's also a lesson to be learned here from
something else that a lot of big budget movies do badly. The inciting incident in the first episode with Johnny, it's entirely believable. Whereas we can look at the closest thing to an inciting incident that there is in The Force Awakens, there's not really one. You don't believe that Luke Skywalker tried to kill Kylo Ren. You don't believe it. The movie tells you words to explain it, but it doesn't make any sense. Your brain rejects it.
It insists upon itself, Lois.
They put Johnny into the situation.
I was wondering when you get that.
The situation with Johnny. But the situation with Johnny where he gets into the inciting incident, you believe it. You believe he makes that decision out of his character. It makes sense.
Yeah, and another thing I like about this, and especially you compare this to STD, where like you said with the inciting incident, it insists upon itself so much and its own perceived greatness that it actually fails to
Yeah.
be even good, much less great. Whereas with Cobra Kai, you believe it because they write it so realistically, where Johnny has been taught, never to back away from a fight. And so when you have that opening sequence where he kind of has to rescue this kid from getting beat up, you believe it because that's the kind of character Johnny was to begin with, and we saw it in the first film. He wasn't in, and even in the first Karate Kid film, you could actually see where you can kind of see both sides of the issue. Where yeah, Johnny's a bully and an asshole, but you can kind of see he's not entirely a bad guy. And Daniel in the first film, and indeed throughout the whole trilogy, wasn't entirely a good guy. And so I think there's that whole gray area where it's like. Which is where most people exist. Not everything is entirely black and white. That makes it so believable.
Yeah, and the relationship with the young man whose name for the character is absolutely escaping me right now. That's also so well done how they set that up. It's really another selling point that the characterizations and the character relationships are so well thought out and written out.
Yeah, and I was kind of like how it kind of. I wouldn't say that it actually challenges this whole social justice warrior thing, because it's actually, it actually is a social justice warrior thing, but it's handled in a way that comes across as being believable. Because no, seriously, because if we're talking about the how Johnny is forced to kind of like grow up finally after over 30 years and kind of come out of the past, where he's confronted with this thing, like a kid with who was born with a cleft lip and has a surgery scar, and he's generally horrified that such a thing could happen. And he actually, in his own clumsy and haphazard way, feels sorry for the kid and realizes, okay, I was making fun of this kid and I probably shouldn't have been. But then it kind of works out where that same kid comes back later and he's given himself a makeover, in terms of both his appearance and his personality. So so it kind of works, and it's handled believably. But at the same time, there's a scene in there in episode 5 where he realizes the existence of online trolls, because he's been living 30 years in the bottom of a bottle, probably never really used a computer, so he doesn't know about the internet and just how pervasive cyberbullying can be. But he actually is kind of surprised by this, but then points out, man, these guys are a bunch of pussies. They're just hiding behind a computer screen and attacking people. And it's like, in my day, if we wanted to tease someone, we did it to their face. And so he's kind of like, there's that sort of like balancing out, that clinging to like hyper masculinity, constantly needs to prove himself, and then realizing, okay, you know what? All right, fine. I'm going to teach you, because you can't spend your life being afraid of what people say online, because that's not the way to live. So again, they're always constantly trying to find a balance between this hyper macho mindset from the 80s that's still lingering and trying to reassert itself, and then at the same time also realizing, yeah, we do have to be more sensitive and more aware of what kids have to go through, because what kids have to go through today, it's nothing like what we had to go through 30 years ago. Because like when
something else I want to say about that is, there's lots of internet social justice drama where every so often you have to say, do you think this is something a real person would complain about? Whereas the stuff you're seeing here this is stuff real people would actually deal with and have real problems with. And this is where you can get a frame where one human being can look at another human being with actual dignity, versus a lot of nonsense that places like the internet and university campuses can amplify, versus reality of being lower to middle class families living in a very expensive part of California and having to struggle with just the stuff that bogs you down in day-to-day life.
Yeah, and to me, it's like, there was so much that could have gone wrong in depicting all of this, but these guys, I have to find out what their background is. Maybe they've had, maybe they're probably about the same age as William Zabka and Ralph Macchio, who are in their 50s. speaking of Ralph Macchio, I think his Wikipedia entry has him at being 56. I don't know if he's quite that old, but he doesn't look it. I mean, he still looks like at least a decade younger.
Also,
which is kind of scary because I just turned 44.
Yeah, I also love him having.
So I'm feeling, So I'm oh my God, never tell me I'm old.
Yeah, I also like how he had a chain of car dealerships. That just seems so fitting for his character.
Yeah,
and just like, yeah,
and then of course he's using the karate as his gimmick for pitching his product, and it's like, so it's like what this is what happens when Daniel becomes like this smug bully instead of Johnny Lawrence. But again, this goes to like what 30 years does to someone, because like it's been that long since, or almost that long since the Karate Kid Part 3, which is where we last saw him on the big screen, where he went through that kind of like darker phase that Miyagi had to pull him out of. And so 30 years is going to change a person, obviously, but it's interesting because again, the focus is on Johnny Lawrence, but the way that they did it, where the rivalry that gets reignited between these two, Daniel just goes back to being kind of a dick like he was in the third movie, but towards the end of the series, he again, he's forced to confront this and learn and grow as a person and kind of realize, what, I really should not have been doing a lot of the shit that I've been doing throughout these 10 episodes. But all right, so we are kind of running short on time, so I'm going to give you the final word. Any final thoughts on the Marvel movies or on Cobra Kai?
I'm favorable of them. Deadpool 2 is good. To me, not as good as the previous Deadpool. That could be something we can talk about at another time when you get the opportunity to see it. But I think really sometime after Solo, we need to go deeper into Star Wars stuff, because there's all sorts of Kremlinology and things that are leaking out of Lucasfilms onto the internet that really paint a very interesting picture of the history of Disney Star Wars.
Yeah, and that's something that's been kind of done to death, but I'm certainly willing to beat a dead horse, because it seems like every movie that they come out with, it's like they demonstrate this like complete and utter failure to learn. And I think the third movie in the trilogy is supposed to be released next year. If they even started filming, it's like, what the hell's going to end up happening?
There's been a leak on the internet. There's been a leak on the internet of the storyboard process, and the guy who leaked it also leaked the storyboard process for The Last Jedi, so he has some degree of credibility. The story is the Resistance is almost dead. Kylo Ren is a successful Emperor of the Galaxy. Our heroes are just about to give up, but a leaker inside the First Order leads them to a secret planet in the unknown regions of space, where the First Order is enslaving aliens from the unknown regions of space. Also, for some reason, Kylo and Rey have a baby that's grown up into a small child. Leia dies defending that child at some point in the movie, and then there's a big confrontation where the leaker is revealed to be General Hux, who's trying to create regime instability to overthrow Kylo Ren. The movie ends with the unknown regions of the galaxy fighting the known regions of the galaxy, which ties up to the Rian Johnson trilogy, where Rian Johnson said he wanted to focus on an unknown part of the Star Wars story that we've never touched on before.
Okay. If oh my God.
Now, again, this is the storyboard phase, so there's things that can be thrown in, but the basic beats
is the screenplay even finished? Is the screenplay even finished?
J.J. Abrams finished the play.
Okay, because if they can do a complete and total rewrite, and because if they haven't actually started shooting yet, they're going to need an entirely different rewrite. Because how the hell do you have Kylo Ren and Rey having a kid together when before they were trying to kill one another for the first two movies, and then oh my God, I've got a
time skip of about 5 years. There's a time skip of about 5 to 10 years And we know that because John Boyega has to grow his hair out before they start filming to represent the passage of time.
Okay, but that can take place over a period of weeks or months. So it doesn't need to take years to grow out hair.
Right, but he has to have longer hair now. But yes, that's one of the other little bits of pieces that have dropped out. But the major things that I know are going to happen is the unknown regions of space thing, because they've been a big focus on Thrawn in the Rebels cartoon series. There's some drama with the contract with Timothy Zahn. They're holding him up until episode 9 comes out, because all the stuff related to Thrawn is going to be connected to that, and that's all going to tie into the Rian Johnson trilogy.
Oh, Lord.
But if you think of the First Order as the alt-right, Kylo Ren is Donald Trump, and he gets to make the galaxy great again. That's what they're setting up for episode 9.
Oh, Lord in heaven. If that's what's leaked out just from the storyboards, and yeah, I don't see anyone actually shelling out money to even go see that in the theaters, much less prop it up on DVD or toys. I mean, they can't sell the toys now as it is. The ones that are based on The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, they're just sitting on shelves gathering dust. So, I mean, they can't even move those. How are they going to sell this piece of crap garbage of a story? Oh, my God. All right,
who wants to play with a Rose Tico? What has Rose Tico done that would make a kid want to play with her action figure? Nothing.
Well, I could think of a few things with the actors who played her, but no, that's just maybe a guy who hasn't had a date in a while. So, yeah, okay, enough of my perving. All right, this has been the Wilk Report with Michael Wilk and Larry Bernard joining us for the discussion. All right, that's pretty much it for now. So take care. Good night. We're out.